The first thing is, this is not a lecture on, basically it's not a lecture by a religious preacher, but an academic lecture. Basically what I'm doing here is, I'm going to survey the literature on dharma and try to give you different understandings of dharma understood in different periods of time in India. Okay, so that is the first thing. It's an academic presentation rather than a kind of a religious preaching. Okay, so when I'm saying the concept of dharma, I'm not trying to tell you that this is dharma and you should follow this or follow that. I'm just trying to give you a kind of a historical and philosophical understanding of dharma. Secondly, it is not based on one book or one person or school of thought. Okay, this my presentation is based on a kind of a survey of literature. Now, yesterday also I presented this topic and I had promised that I'd present a bibliography, but actually after presenting, I forgot about the bibliography. So let me give you the bibliography beforehand. So if you want to know more about the topic or the say the style of presentation that I have done, so you can go through some important works. In philosophy, there are two important books which I have used in to develop my understanding of Indian philosophy. Of course, I have also studied the original texts of different darshanas, so that is also there. But to get a kind of a outline of whole Indian philosophy, I suggest two textbooks. One is by Chandradhar Sharma. It is known as A Critical Survey of Indian Philosophy. It is a book prescribed for MA level in Indian philosophy. So Chandradhar Sharma, A Critical Survey of Indian Philosophy. It's a very good book. And it basically focuses, the focus of Chandradhar Sharma is on Madhyamika Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. So that is his focus. He basically dismisses the some other schools. But if you want to really understand Madhyamika Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, it's very good. Also, the other philosophies like Nyaya, Sankhya and all, those are also covered. Okay, so it's a good textbook. If you want more details, then there's another book. This is not a book actually. This is actually in 5 volumes, 5 books by Surendranath Dasgupta, A History of Indian Philosophy. Okay, so it's a very good good presentation of Indian philosophy because it goes into details. So that's why it is 5 books. First 4 books are very detailed. The 5th one, that is on the Shaiva philosophy, that was published after the death of Surendra Dasgupta. He was never able to complete the 5th book. So the 5th book is very brief. Okay, it's not very detailed. But the first 4 books are very detailed. It goes deeply into various Indian schools of philosophy. So these are 2 important textbooks on Indian philosophy. Then, as far as some of the ideas are concerned, I've studied 2 books by Rajiv Malhotra. One is Being Different, the other is Indra's Net. Okay, so Being Different tries to differentiate between Indian philosophy or Indian way of life and the Western assumptions, which is basically based on Christianity. Here, the West basically for Rajiv Malhotra comes from Christianity, and the ideas that have been borrowed by even the secular thinkers, Enlightenment thinkers, borrowed from Christianity. Okay, so he's assuming that West is basically coming from a Christian kind of a background, while the Indian is coming from a Hindu background, Hindu Buddhist, whatever, the different schools of thought. So there is something common in this Indian understanding, and there is something, it is different from the Western understanding. So that is Being Different. Then the other book, Indra's Net, is about the philosophical unity of Hinduism, because you can see in India, there are different schools of thought which have contradictory views. There are differences. So in the Indra's Net, Rajiv Malhotra basically tries to say that all the philosophies are interconnected. There is a different perspective, but the truth is the same. Okay, so the term Indra's Net is actually Indrajal. It occurs in the Atharva Veda. Okay, Indrajal basically means that there is a kind of a spider's net, and in each knot there is a gem. And so the light is passing through the gems, and and from each gem it goes to the other gem, and so the whole net is lighted by the gems, and we don't know what is the origin, what is the beginning, which is so every gem is important in itself. Every gem gives us light. Okay, so that means all the different schools of thought in Hinduism are interconnected. Okay, although the emphasis may be different, there is some kind of a network between them. Okay, so these are very good books. You may agree or disagree with them, but they're very interesting. They give you some kind of a perspective. Now, I also recommend certain blogs that I have studied. Three important blogs. One blog is by Ashay Nayak. Ashay Nayak's blog is known as Satya Nritam, or Truth and Falsity. It's a very good blog where he has dealt in details on the concept of dharma from various perspectives. So please go into it. He's very critical and a very sharp mind. So he has written a number of good essays on the topic of dharma. Then there are other two blogs, basically to discuss Indian history, ancient Indian history, and so on. One is by Shrikant Talagiri, and the other is by Conrad Els. So I recommend them also. So their influence is also there on me. Then in terms of podcasts, there in YouTube, there are some, because some topics here I have taken, because I have been influenced by some of the ideas some of the guests have presented in these podcasts. Not necessarily, I'm not saying the whole, the podcaster's view is reflected in this presentation, but like I am a regular watcher of these podcasts, and some ideas that I have taken have come from some of the guests who have appeared in this podcast. One is the Charvaka podcast of Kushal Mehra, and the other one is Abhinav Prakash's podcast. Okay, so this is some brief bibliography. There are two books I would like to recommend. They are original works. This is for the last part of my presentation. You can study them also. They also give us very good idea of the Indian way of thinking. One is Dayanand Saraswati's Satyarth Prakash. It's a very lengthy book, but it gives you his views on different schools of thought in India, as well as Christianity, Islam, etc. But more important from our point of view, he discusses different schools of thought in India. Okay, so that's why it's interesting. The other one is by Savarkar, that is Plus Essentials of Hindutva. Okay, so that is basically a brief bibliography of the sources, you can say, for the lecture. Anyhow, so let me move ahead. So in the concept of dharma, I basically discuss dharma from in 4 periods. There are 4 periods. First is from the Vedic society. I have written like the Sanskrit words I have written in Devanagari, not in Romanization, because the pronunciation is always like incorrect if you use English. Okay, because 26 letters don't represent all the sounds in Sanskrit language. So I've used the Devanagari script here, but the presentation is in English. So the Vedic society is the first phase. Then I discuss Manusmriti briefly, then Bhakti Andolan, the Bhakti movement, and then the 4th one is Adhunikvad. Okay, so the concept of dharma in India has evolved through the various phases. Now, some of you have been in my lectures in the past, and so you might have come across the subject and the slides, but this is a kind of a different presentation, a different style. Okay, so let me continue. So Vedic society. So we begin with the concept of dharma in Vedic society. So in Vedic society, the main idea is the concept of Rita. Okay, the Rita is the central idea in Vedic society. So what is the meaning of Rita? Rita is like a cosmic law. Okay, it means that there are certain, there's certain principles that govern the world. Okay, the world is not sporadic or spontaneous. There's some kind of an order, a cosmic order. Okay, so like for example, we use the word Ritu. Okay, so Ritu means seasons. So seasons mean cycles. Every year the seasons are repeated. The 6 seasons come one after another. Okay, and next year again the seasons start from the beginning. And same thing with the movement of the sun, the moon, the stars, the whole sky we look at, and everything around us. So the Vedic people saw that, and they understood that there's a pattern to how the world functions. Okay, so that is known as Rita. Now, what is dharma then? Dharma, that means, is to live your life according to the cosmic order, according to Rita. So the Vedic people, primarily for them, the most important thing was performance of yajna. Okay, so the Vedic cosmology is hierarchical in nature. Okay, so the vegetation, the plants are below, then there are animals, and then there are humans. Okay, so humans are above the others. So humans use animals and plants in their day-to-day life, for example, for food, and most importantly, for performing yajna. What is yajna? Yajna is the human connection with the Rita. Okay, so humans can connect with the Rita through yajna. Okay, so in the Vedas there's a concept of devas. Okay, devatas. So what are these devas or devatas? So these are natural forces, cosmic forces like Indra, Varuna, Agni, Vayu. These are various natural forces. Okay, so these are all considered to be part of the Rita. Okay, so the devas are basically serving the Rita. They are all controlled by the Rita. They are not independent, but they are all all the cosmic forces, all the natural forces are controlled by this cosmic order called Rita. So therefore, in order to connect with these cosmic forces, the Vedic people used to perform yajna. And in this yajna, both plants and animals were used. So the whole nature, the whole environment is connected with the yajna. So yajna is basically was the center of the Vedic life. Now, in terms of the human society, they divided human society into 4 varna and 4 ashrama. Okay, so 4 varna are Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. In the Purusha Sukta of the Rig Veda, in the 10th mandala, you can see that it is the 4 varnas are compared with the human body. Okay, so this is the representation I'm showing in the picture. And then there are 4 ashrams. So these are stages of life. Okay, so brahmacharya ashram, grihastha ashram, so on. So brahmacharya means student life when you are studying, and grihastha ashram means when you start earning a living, you have a family, you have to maintain your family. So in the grihastha ashram, you have to be divided into 4 varnas according to your function. So there are functional divisions. Okay, so I'll not go into details of that, but dharma essentially here means performing your duty according to your varna and according to your ashrama. Okay, so if you are a brahmachari, that means you go to your guru, you serve your guru, you learn from the guru, study every day. Okay, maintain a very clean and simple life. And so this is the dharma of a brahmachari, one in a brahmacharya ashram. Or similarly, in terms of varna, so if you are a brahmana, then you have a particular dharma to perform. Okay, so basically the activities of brahmana are divided into 6: yajan yajan, adhyayan adhyapan, dana, pratigraha. Okay, so yajan yajan means to perform yajna for yourself and for others, for your yajaman or for yourself. Adhyayan adhyapan means to learn the Vedic mantras and to teach them to others. Then the other is dana pratigraha. So how does a Brahman survive? A Brahman survives by taking dakshina from others. Okay, so it's basically others have to give dakshina to a Brahmana, and whatever extra Brahmana has, Brahma he has to donate. He has to give to others because Brahmana is supposed to be poor. Okay, so that is the dharma of Brahmana. Similarly, the dharma of other varnas and other ashramas. So you have to, so in the Vedic society, what is the meaning of dharma? That means dharma means to steadfastly follow your duty according to your station in life. Okay, in the next diagram, I give details of the Vedic Yajna and so on. So I'll not go into details of this. Now, you see, Vedic society was not prevalent all over the Indian subcontinent or all over those places where today Hindu civilization exists, or it existed, say, in the past. Because in the past, the area of Hindu civilization was very large, okay, including Southeast Asia and even parts of Central Asia followed the principles of Hindu civilization. The Vedic society actually begins in the Sapta Sindhu area. Today is Punjab, Haryana area. Okay, so essentially Puru Bharatas were the people who were, developing these Vedic rituals and so on. And gradually it spread to the Vedic knowledge and the Vedic way of life spread to other parts. Okay, but this did not spread through subordination of other way of life. Rather, it spread through integrating with the local practices in different other parts of the country. So these practices in other parts of the country were essentially centered around worship of Murti Puja. Okay, so they used to worship in temples. So in the Vedas, there is no reference to any Murti Puja or temple worship. Okay, this is essentially tantric practice based on another set of texts known as the Tantras and Agama. Okay, the Tantra and Agama are the core texts for Murti Puja and for worship in them. And this was prevalent all over India, as you can see from archaeological findings and the ancient temples that we have. This is an ancient practice. So gradually we see a process by which, there's an integration between the Vedic and the Tantric systems in India. Okay, so Vedic rituals were adopted in different parts of India, including in temple worship. Similarly, the Vedic people also, included the different local gods and goddesses as manifestations of Vedic gods like Vishnu. Okay, so Vishnu is a Vedic god. Essentially, it is related to in the Vedas. Vishnu means it is related to the movement of the sun. Okay, so it's also known as Trivikrama, 3 steps. Okay, rise at noon and then sunset. Okay, so that represents Vishnu represents the movement of the sun. Anyhow, that is in the Vedas. But Vishnu then gradually appears as the supreme god and so on, and then there's the concept of avatar of Vishnu, because in the Mathura area there was Krishna worship prevalent, or in eastern UP the worship of Rama was existent, and there are many other avatars that were worshipped in different parts. For example, in Orissa and Andhra area, Narasingha was very, very popular, lion. Okay, half man and half lion, that form was worshipped. So all these in the tantric texts and later on in the Puranas, which were written in Sanskrit. So these texts basically created concepts, okay, which try to integrate the Vedic understanding with the tantric understanding. So this Rajiv Malhotra calls as open architecture of Hinduism. That whole Hinduism is an open architecture. So there are some pre-existing ideas in Hinduism, but Hinduism is an open system. So new ideas can come and they can integrate with already existing ideas if they are compatible. They have to be compatible. Okay, so somehow so dharma has this technique. Okay, so in the Vedic system, dharma means following varna and ashrama duties. While in the tantric tradition, it is basically centered around the deity. Okay, so for example, the Vaishnavas, okay, they worship Vishnu. So they're a Vaishnava Tantra. So Vishnu is giving his teachings in those tantras. So the Vaishnavas practice those tantras. They follow the teachings given there. Or the Shaivas, they have the Shaiva Agamas. So they follow the teachings in the Shaiva Agamas. So the tantric way of understanding of dharma is basically is that follow the command of the deity. Okay, so the goal is essentially to get something, maybe you have some problem you want to solve, or go to the highest place. Okay, the Parampadam, as Veda calls Parampadam, which in Tantra means either it's Vaikuntha of Vishnu or Kailash of Shiva, according to the sect. But there are other sects also, like Shaktas and so on. And there are various understandings. Okay, so I won't go into details. I hope you understood the difference. Okay, so if you have any questions regarding this, I'll address in the end. Okay, so let me move on. So you see, Hinduism is complex. Hinduism is essentially this combination of the Vedic system and the Tantric system. Okay, that came to be known as Hinduism. Now, let's go to the next period. The next period is period of Manusmriti. So Manusmriti is essentially a kind of a reaction against the unorthodox practices that had emerged. Okay, Manusmriti is a reassertion of Vedic authority. Manusmriti tries to say that Veda is the most important text. So it says, so this is a shloka that I have quoted from Manusmriti, Vedo Akhilo Dharma Mulam. I won't go to the whole shloka. You can see here below sources of Dharma. So from this shloka, I have derived the 4 sources of Dharma. First is Veda. So Veda is the highest knowledge. So everything has to be according to the Veda, according to Manusmriti. So Veda is the primary text. Akhilo Dharma Mulam. All Dharma actually comes from the Veda. Okay, so there are different debates, of course, related to the Veda, origin of Veda, and so on. There's a Mimamsa school and there's a Nyaya school. So there's a debate between the two, which I'll not go into today. I have another lecture after this. Maybe it will take some time to prepare, in which I'll discuss different schools of thought. Okay, that will come later, in which I'll discuss Mimamsa, Nyaya, and other schools of thought. Anyhow, so Veda is the first primary source. Then is Smriti. Smriti refers to like Manusmriti and the Dharma Shastras. There are different Dharma Shastras. So Manusmriti is kind of a representative sample of Dharma Shastra. The most important, generally. Okay, no, it's not like universally accepted, but generally, as among Dharma Shastra, Manusmriti has been given a lot of privilege. And in the Dharma Shastras, Manu says that there are 2 types of smritis, orthodox and heterodox. Orthodox smritis are those smritis that are according to the Vedas, that accept the authority of the Veda. And unorthodox or heterodox smritis are those which are against the Vedic teachings. For example, say those who reject the Vedic teachings. For example, the Buddhists or the Jains who reject the authority of the Vedas. So they also have their smritis. So those smritis are not accepted by Manu. They say it is not part of, it is not dharma. It is not part of dharma. So this is a reassertion of the Vedic system. Okay, Manusmriti. Similarly, he also criticizes Bhagavata and Pashupata sect also. These are, so which today we know as the Vaishnavas and Shaivas. Because instead of Vedas, they put more importance to their own deity. Okay, so their own tantric texts are more important for them than the Vedas. So he criticizes them also for not putting Vedas as the primary. Later on, of course, the Vaishnavas and the Shaiva philosophy also accepted the primacy of the Vedic text, but it happened later in the Bhakti movement. Okay, before that, there was a kind of a, it was a kind of a separate type of a system. So Manu criticizes them. It says that you have to accept the primacy of the Vedic text. So this is the second source of Dharma. Then there is a third source, that is Sadachara. Sadachara means customs. So local level, there are different customs. For example, marriage. Okay, so Vivaha Samskara. So there is Vivaha Samskara in the Vedas. There are certain rituals related to that are performed according to the Vedas. But you see, there are local customs also. For example, in Punjab, there are certain local customs, how marriage is done. In Assam, there is a separate custom. There's a difference. Okay, so these are local customs. These are known as Sadachar because they don't contradict the Shastra. Okay, so they are Sadachar. But those customs which contradict the Shastra, they are not Sadachar. They are rejected. But those customs which don't violate the Shastra, they are accepted as Sadachar because they are performed by the righteous. It is according to the Shastra. So Sadachar or local customs are also Dharma. Okay, so if suppose you are doing something according to the local customs, it doesn't mean it is Adharma, but it is also Dharma because it is a kind of a accepted tradition. Finally, the fourth source is Atma Tushti. Atma Tushti means self-satisfaction. In some cases, like you cannot refer to the Shastra because there is not mentioned. So in day-to-day life, it is not possible to find everything in the text or and everything in the custom because society keeps on changing. So in day-to-day life, you have to use your own intelligence to say what is dharma, adharma. But it is the fourth source. Okay, Atma Tushti is the so Veda is the ultimate, is the mula. Okay, rest come after the Veda. Okay, so these are the sources of of dharma according to Manu. So based on this, he divides dharma into four types. Okay, first is sadharana dharma. This is dhiti, shama, indriya nigraha. You know that means forgiveness, non-violence, control of your senses, and all that. Okay, so these are common for everyone. Everyone should practice. All human beings should practice these good teachings. Okay, that is known as sadharana dharma. Then there is something known as swadharma, which is same as varna ashrama dharma. So according to your varna and according to your ashrama, you perform certain duties. Okay, so that I already discussed in the context of the Vedic society. So that is another one. And the third one is apata dharma. In some cases, emergency situations, what happens is that you are not able to perform your duties according to your varna or ashrama. For example, there is a brahmana who is not able to get any dakshina, he doesn't have any yajman. How would the brahmana survive? So Manusmriti allows the brahmana to do other things like become a warrior or practice, do some trading. So Manusmriti says that you can do trading in these things, but you cannot do in these other things, do's and don'ts and so on. So that is known as apata dharma, emergency duties. Okay, in case of, because ultimately you have to survive. So survival is important. So in those cases, you are allowed to perform some other activities. Then there's a fourth one that is known as prayashchitta. Prayashchitta means if you commit an adharmic act, you go against dharma somehow. So there's a process by which you perform certain rituals and you counteract the effect, the karmic effect of your wrongdoing. Okay, so mostly it's like fasting. Suppose you told a lie, then you have to perform some rites and so on. Or prayashchitta can also mean punishment by the state. So suppose there's a thief who steals or someone murders someone, then the state punishes that person. So by punishing that person, the state is performing prayashchitta, okay, of the negative karmic activity. So that also actually counteracts negative karma. Anyhow, so in this way, so you can see here in Manusmriti, dharma essentially is to live your life according to Shastra. So Shastric injunctions, whatever has been told in the Shastras, to live by that is dharma, according to Manusmriti. So what is the ultimate goal? Ultimate goal, as you can see in this shloka, is to attain Param Padam. Brahmaveti Param Padam. It means to understand by performing these dharmic acts every day, what happens is gradually you become detached from your sensual desires. Okay, because you don't do anything according to your sensual desires, but you do according to a written text. So you are very strict in your performance of dharma. So gradually you become detached. And then you begin to understand who is the doer. The doer is the Atma. Okay, you understand that you are the doer. Atma is the doer. And you see that Atma in everyone because everyone is doing because of that Atma inside that person. Okay, so you become equal to everyone. You see Brahman in everyone. Okay, and so you attain that the stage, the intellectual stage or the spiritual stage of Brahman. Okay, you become transcendent. You attain the highest position. You become equal to everyone. You see Atma everywhere. Okay, so that is ultimately the goal of dharma. So in this way, Manu is connecting dharma with moksha. So how to achieve dharma according to Manusmriti is the performance of dharma. Okay, so this is Manusmriti. Now let's go to the next stage, that is the bhakti movement. Okay, so the beginning of bhakti movement, we have the Advaita philosophy. Now Advaita philosophy is very interesting because Adi Shankara is also trying to, just like Manu tried to assert the authority of the Vedas, but what happened is the Tantric, because the Tantrics won't be attracted to that system. Okay, because the people who are worshiping Vishnu or Shiva, if we are condemning their system, then why would they accept the authority of the Vedas? So what Adi Shankara did was basically he tried to bring everyone together. He criticized number of Indian philosophies, but he also tried to bring in the different practices within the umbrella of Advaita Vedanta. So Advaita Vedanta is very interesting. Okay, how does Adi Shankara achieve this? Okay, Shankaracharya achieves this. He says actually there is only one reality. That reality is known as Brahma. This Brahma is nirguna. There is no form or name of this entity. Okay, it's beyond all name and form. It's transcendental. So this is the reality. So that is known as Paramarthika, absolute reality. Okay, so there's no difference. So your Atma or my Atma is not different. Okay, so everything is actually one. There's only one Atma. There's no we. There's only I. Okay, so I am that. Tattvamasi. Okay, I am that. I am the Brahma, Ekam. Now, there is another concept known as Maya. So the question is, where does Maya come from? Because there's only Brahma. Where does Maya come from? Does Maya exist? So the Advaitins, they say Maya, we can't say whether Maya exists or not. It is anirvachaniya. No word can describe it. It is there, but whether ultimately is there or not, we cannot describe. Okay, anyhow, so it's a kind of basically, you are not answering the question, you are simply skipping the question. Anyhow, so because of Maya, there's another reality that comes into existence that is known as Sansara. Okay, that is the Vyavaharika or empirical reality. Now, why this is important? So, empirical reality is our world, our empirical world, the world of multiplicity, the world of plurality. So, in the empirical reality, Adi Shankara says, according to our consciousness, we're attracted to some form of worship. Okay, so he says it's okay. So, suppose there's a Vaishnava worshipping Vishnu according to the Vishnu Tantras. So, it's okay because that person has that level of consciousness. So, in the Grihastha Dharma, you can worship any form of Ishvara. Okay, you can worship any form according to Adi Shankara. Okay, in fact, so the followers of Adi Shankara, they are known as Smarta. Okay, the Smarta Sampradaya. So they worship Pancha Devata, Panchayatana worship. Okay, Ganesha, Vishnu, Shiva, Durga, and Surya. These were the 5 main deities during this period. Okay, 5 important sampradayas. And so, so dharma here is multiple, is pluralistic. Okay, so according to your consciousness, you perform your dharma as a grihastha. But as a sannyasi, your main duty is to perform, is to follow the jnana marga. You can see here, jnana marga. There is a philosophical understanding. Okay, so grihasthas, according to your consciousness, you perform your different modes of worship, but that is not the ultimate reality. Ultimate reality can only be achieved through jnana marga, and only by performing the study of the Vedanta philosophy, the works of Advaita Vedanta, you can understand, you can realize that all is one. So it's like Brahma Satyam, it's called Brahma Satyam, Jagan Mithya, Jivo Brahmaiva Napara. Brahma is the reality, Jagat, that is Sansara, is Mithya, it's illusion. Okay. Jivo Brahmaiva Napara. There's no difference between the Jiva and the Brahma. So we are all actually Brahma. There's no we, there's only I, there's one. Okay, so understanding that gives you moksha. Okay, so Maya is destroyed and you become one with your own self. Okay, so that is Advaita Vedanta. So interestingly, Advaita Vedanta was able to, integrate different sampradayas within its grand superstructure. Okay. So this is basically this led to a kind of eruption of the Bhakti movement, because this justified basically the practices recommended by the different tantras. And he tried to justify it using the Upanishads and Manusmriti. These are 2 important sources that Adi Shankara used to justify his philosophy. Anyhow, so there was, of course, disagreement also with that. It's not that everyone agreed with his Advaita Vedanta. As a response, there came different types of Vedanta. But as a sample, because I can't discuss each and every one of them, I have taken a sample that is Dvaita Vedanta of Madhvacharya, or Ananda Tirtha Purna Pragya or Madhvacharya, same person. So his Siddhanta is known as Dvaita Vedanta. Okay, so in Dvaita Vedanta, there are two realities. Dvaita means two, Advaita means one. So one reality, according to Shankara, there is only one ultimate reality. According to Madhva, there are two ultimate realities. Okay, one is Swatantra, other is Aswatantra. One reality is Swatantra, and that is only Ishvara. Ishvara is that one reality, and he is not Nirgun, but he is Sagun. He has qualities. Okay, he has various qualities and so on. So it's closer to the monotheistic, Abrahamic monotheistic concept, a creator God, a God who creates. Okay, so it's Swatantram, Aswatantam cha, etc. and Swatantram Bhagavana Vishnu, and so because you are the Vaishnava, Madhva. Okay, so for him, Ishvara is Bhagavan Vishnu. This philosophy can also be applied to other schools also. Okay, but like the Shaivas, then in that case it will be Shiva. Okay, so here Maya is the power of God. Maya is not something which covers Ishvara, but Maya is actually his energy, his power, and with the help of Maya, he creates the samsara. Okay, and samsara is not one, but it has different entities. So there are Jiva and Jada. Jiva means the Atma, the living entities, and Jada means matter. Okay, material energy. Okay, so that is the asatanta, dependent reality. That is also real. Okay, the samsara is also real. Unlike in Advaita Siddhanta, where only Brahma is real, while samsara is an illusion, here both Ishvara and samsara are real. And the marga is, the process is bhakti, to devotional service, to bhakti. Shastra, according to Madhva, are the Vedas. The Vedas are the supreme, but he also says that they are the Pancharatras, these are the Vaishnava Tantras. They are also Shastra. Ramayana, Mahabharata also. Also the Sattvic Puranas, the Vaishnava Purana. So these are the Shastras according to Madhva. If you follow them, if you practice bhakti according to them, then you achieve moksha. Moksha according to him is Parampadam. You don't become one with God, but you basically go to the abode of God. You go to the home of God, the eternal home. Okay, or Vaikuntha. So this is the Dvaita Siddhanta. So this became very popular, and bhakti movement spread all over the country. You know, they're different. Of course, this is not, people didn't follow Dvaita Siddhanta everywhere. There's a Vishishta Advaita of Ramanuja, Achintya Veda Ved of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and so on. So different bhakti saints, they gave their own versions of this Dvaita Vedanta. But ultimately, it is Dvaita, because Ishvara is not same as Jiva. There's a difference between independent reality and dependent reality. So in that sense, they are all Dvaita, although they themselves might be called Advaita, like Vishishta Advaita. But actually, it's Dvaita. There's a difference. Okay, there's not one reality, but two realities. Okay, so the bhakti movement spread, and so here, what is dharma? Dharma here means you do bhakti. Bhakti becomes dharma. Performance of bhakti becomes dharma. Of course, this also led to some conflict. As you know, in Dravida, in southern India, there was a conflict between the Vaishnavas and Shaivas for some time. Okay, later on, gradually it settled down, and kind of a compromise was reached. As you can see from the works of say some saints in Maharashtra. Okay, like people like Gyanadev and Namdev and so on, who try to integrate Advaita and Bhakti, or say in Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas, where he tries to really integrate Advaita and Vishishta Advaita in his works, where he's also revering Shiva and Rama both. Okay, so it's kind of a, gradually the conflict stopped and things settled down. Okay, in the Bhakti movement. Now let's come. So this was basically what we call the medieval period. Okay. Next we move to Adhunikvad. Now Adhunikvad means basically modernity, emergence of modern ideas. Okay, and so I have come across some literature which actually says modern ideas emerged during the Bhakti movement itself in the form of Nirguna Bhakti. So far I was teaching you about telling you about the Saguna Bhakti, but there was another movement known as Nirguna Bhakti. So the Nirguna Bhakti tradition, there are many saints in that tradition, but I have picked three here in this diagram. You can see Kabir, Ravidas, and Nanak. Okay, so these were Bhakti saints, but they believe in Nirguna. So Nirguna is actually rationalism introduced into the Bhakti. So they reject many rituals which are performed by Bhakti people, followers of Bhakti. The Bhakta, they perform different rituals, and so they gave a kind of a logical critique of these rituals. They say that the rituals are very expensive. You must understand, this is under Islamic rule. So Islamic rule was very brutal, it was exploitative, and there was a lot of poverty all over the country, and the caste system had become very rigid. Okay, and so the general population was not able to perform these expensive rituals, and so they said we should give up these rituals. We should be rational. Okay, and so there are critiques of Murti Puja and temple worship and so on, because they are very expensive, and they say that these priests, they cheat us and so on. And so the common people should get something rational, some happiness in this life itself, some experience of happiness in this life. So they recommended japa, meditation. Okay, you meditate and you achieve happiness through your meditation. Okay, known as Sahaja Yoga, and these type of terms are used. Sahaja, easily achieved inner happiness through meditation. Okay, or japa, calling out the name of God. Who is God here? Here, the concept of God is similar to the Nirguna concept. Okay, the Shankara's concept of Nirguna Brahma. So the deity here is without any form, or without any qualities, beyond everything. Okay, so that is rational. Rationalism here doesn't mean atheism or materialism. Rationalism essentially means rejection of expensive rituals. Then these Bhakti saints are also critiques of the caste system. Okay, some of them came from caste which were performing activities which are considered impure by say the Brahmins and so on. Okay, for example, Ravidas was a cobbler, or Kabir was a weaver. Okay, Nanak was a trader. He came from by birth he came from the Kshatriya Varna, but he was trader by profession. So these are considered to be unclean by the Brahmins, the priests. Okay, and so they believed in a kind of an egalitarian society, a society where there's no jati pratha or varna divisions. Okay, where everyone is equal. Ravidas in his writings talks about the concept of Begampura. Begam means without sorrow, city without sorrows. Begampura means a city without sorrows, a city where there is no inequality. Okay, where there are no expensive rituals, and there is dignity of labor. Whatever you do, there's dignity. So they rejected sannyasa dharma. Okay, they were completely against sannyasa dharma. They said to live by begging is irresponsible. Okay, it's adharmic. Dharma means, according to them, performing your duty, getting married, having children, earning your living by your hard work, and meditating on nirguna. Okay, and achieving inner happiness. Okay, so of course they accepted the concept of other cosmological concepts like Ishvara and Punarjanma and so on, but those things which were like ritualistic, they rejected. Okay, so scholars say that this is kind of a beginning of modern thought in India. So modernism began even in the pre-modern period in India. Okay, then we have the Hindu Sudhar Andolan, Hindu reform movement, of which there are three important things. There are many thinkers, but I have picked three important ones because each of their ideas is unique, it's different. And that's why I have picked three of them. First is, of course, Ram Mohan Roy. He was perhaps the first person in India who understood the West. He understood that the West is superior because of modern science. Okay, they have and their system of governance. They have a very sophisticated system of governance. The education system is very robust because it's based on science, and therefore they have been able to colonize. The British were able to colonize India because they were superior in their method, scientific method and governance. And so he recommended that the Hindu society should be reformed according to the scientific ideas or philosophical ideas coming from the West. So he began the reform movement, the Brahma Samaj, and he criticized many practices that were done by the Hindus at that time, or like the sati pratha or child marriage, a caste system. He rejected all that, and he recommended a more westernized form of Hinduism. Okay, just like people go to the church and do their prayers and so on. So the Hindus also should, try to be more like that rather than doing murti puja and all that. So that was so basically the liberal tradition in India begins from Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Raja, the title of Raja was given by the Mughal emperor. So I generally don't use the titles in front of people's names. Okay, I use just the names. So next is Dayananda Saraswati. Dayananda Saraswati, founder of Arya Samaj. Now his idea is unique. Okay, he said go back to the Vedas. His idea was these Purana and Tantra actually have corrupted Hinduism. Okay, they have corrupted the interpretation of Dharma. So for Dharma, you must go back to the Vedas. And he emphasized a lot on logic. Okay, the Nyaya Shastras. So you have to apply logic, and wherever there's some kind of illogical thing, you have to reinterpret the Vedas. You have to interpret the Vedas according to the logic. And he also believed in Manusmriti. So, in Arya Samaj, they took the Manusmriti and they found these contradictory verses. Okay, the shlokas in Manusmriti which contradict logic or the Vedas, or there's some internal contradictions, and they removed them. And they published something known as Vishuddha Manusmriti. Okay, without these. So basically the emphasis on the Vedas. So what is Dharma? Dharma, according to Dayananda Saraswati, is performance of your Vedic injunctions and using logic to. So whatever is logical, whatever is according to the Veda Vakya, that has to be accepted. That is Dharma. Now there is a third school of Vivekananda. Vivekananda was something like Adi Shankara. So Dayananda actually rejected many of the Hindu practices. Okay, he was very aggressive about it. Well, on the other hand, Vivekananda was different because he, included all the different Hindu practices. So he was a kind of a different kind of reformer. He wanted to integrate different Hindu practices. Okay, so he was a proponent of Advaita Vedanta. So he transformed the way Advaita Vedanta is presented. Okay, according to Vivekananda, Advaita Vedanta, just like Shankara was able to unite the different sects like Vaishnavas and Shaivas within Advaita Vedanta, similarly, Advaita Vedanta should also be able to integrate modernity within it. Okay, so he welcomed modernity as a part of the Vedantic philosophy, Advaita Vedanta philosophy. So in that case, of course, some practices have to be given up. It's not possible to. So if you integrate two things, there are some practices that have to be given up. Okay, so his focus was on becoming strong, on karma yoga, performing your duties to society, on anubhav, truth that is acquired through your own experience. Okay, so he used to say things like, instead of reading the Bhagavad Gita, you should go and play football, because football would make you physically strong. And we are, colonized by the British because we are weak. We have to be physically strong. So we should play football. Or he used to say, instead of watering the tulsi plant, you should water the eggplant. Okay, bangan or brinjal. Okay, so because if you eat brinjal, you will become strong, while tulsi does not have the same qualities. So he was a modernist in that sense. He wanted to, change many of the ideas within Hinduism. But he was an integrationist. Okay, he wanted to, integrate Hinduism, the various practices within Hinduism, based on Anubhav, with modern way of thinking. Now this, the Hindu reform movement basically led to another idea that is known as Hindu Rashtravad, Hindu nationalism, or Hindutva. Okay, this is the concept of Bharat Mata. So Vivekananda's concept of karma yoga is very important in this. So dharma is not just according to the Hindutva ideal. Dharma is not about performing your do's and don'ts, your beliefs and so on, your rituals and so on. Dharma is about serving the society. And the most important thing in society is the concept of nation. Okay, so Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay was a very important thinker in this. He wrote Anand Mat, which contains Vande Mataram, the concept of Mother India. Okay, so India is our mother, it's our motherland, it's sacred. Okay, because it provides us with everything, our sustenance, it's the land of our ancestors. Okay, we are connected, deeply connected with the land and its rituals and its history and so on. So it's like a mother. Okay, so we must revere, we must worship mother. Okay, just like we worship Durga, so we should worship Bharat also, India also, because it nourishes us. Okay, that is what Vande Mataram. You should all memorize Vande Mataram because it's a national song. So you see, so Vande Mataram contains all these references of how Mother India, Bharat Mata, nourishes us. Okay, so we must serve the. So ultimately, dharma is not just about individual moksha, in individual liberation. It's about service to the nation, to dedicate your life to the nation. So many people were inspired by this concept. Let me mention Savarkar. Savarkar was a very important thinker. He was influenced by this. And this concept of Hindu Rashtra emerged from his writings. Okay. Of course, there are other thinkers before him also, but I'm focused. I cannot talk about everyone. I'm already taken, I think, more than 50 minutes. I'll finish it within a few minutes now. It should not exceed 1 hour, so I'll try to go quickly. So Savarkar, in his Essentials of Hindutva, talks about the territorial nature of India. Okay, he says, A Sindhu, Sindhu Paryantam. Okay, from Sindhu to Sindhu, this land is Bharat. Yasta Bharata Bhumika. Punyabhu, Pitribhushchaiva, and so on. So there are three concepts here. One is the territory of India, from Sindhu to Sindhu, from the Sindhu River to the Sindhu Ocean. Sindhu means ocean also. So from Sindhu to Sindhu, this is Bharat, Bhumi. Okay, and this is our mother, Mother India. Okay, and those people who consider this to be their Pitribhu, means fatherland, the land of their ancestors, and Punyabhu, their holy land. Okay, those people are Hindus. Okay, so here he creates this concept of Hindu Rashtra. So essentially, people who consider some other territory or some other land, or they don't consider India to be the holy land, those people somehow are not part of this Hindu Rashtra. So essentially, he is referring to Muslims and Christians. It's a very detailed work. I won't go into details today. So this is the concept of Hindu Rashtra. Now, along with this also is the concept of Akhanda Bharat. So India was partitioned in 1947, and people like, say, Ambedkar, they welcomed it. They said that by partitioning India, you have welcomed this is a welcome development, because now the Hindus would be in an overwhelming majority in this remaining part of the land, and we can create our own destiny. We don't have to appease anyone. Okay, and because the Muslims have been separated, so the minorities, large percentage of minorities have gone away, and so it's a good thing. But the Hindu nationalists never supported it. They opposed it, because for them this land of India is holy. It's the mother. So it's like cutting the limbs, the hands of the mother. Okay, so that is unacceptable. That is adharmic. So therefore they keep on recommending Akhanda Bharat. Although if you see realistically, it may be actually not in the interest of the Hindus, because a large number of Muslims would also, if say Pakistan and Bangladesh unite with India, the percentage of Muslims will increase. And so that may not be in the Hindu interest. But the Hindu nationalists, they support Akhanda Bharat, because for them this land is holy. It's one land. It's a kind of a living entity, organic. It's an organic concept of the nation. So in this, Hegdewar also played a very important role. Keshav Baliram Hegdewar, who was the founder of RSS. So he believed that Sangathan is very important, social organization. So Hindus have to organize themselves. Dharma cannot be individual, as Savarkar says. So you need an organization. So Hegdewar believed that the RSS would be an organization of Hindus, okay, by which the Hindus can protect themselves from, say, external threats, and they can build their own character, and this character won't be based on the Dharma Shastras. or the Vedic injunctions, but this will be based on service to the nation. The concept for RSS is service to nation. So for them, it does not matter if say, what is your practice, whom you worship, that is not important. And therefore, you see in RSS, many people criticize them also. So many say Orthodox Hindus also criticize them because they say that they don't follow many of the Orthodox practices. And also they are criticized by some Hindu nationalists because they say the Muslims also have the same DNA, the Christians also have the same DNA. Because the goal of RSS is actually nation building. And so they believe that in nation building, you cannot exclude anyone. So there is some problem with Muslims and Christians because of the exclusive nature of their religion. But if they somehow give up that exclusivity and try to integrate with the Hindu society, then even they are acceptable. Okay, so they have this Muslim Rashtriya Manch and so on. So they basically are trying to create an social organization. Okay, so in terms of dharma, it is important because here dharma, what is the meaning of dharma? Here dharma means nation building, working for the service of nation. So if you are working for the service of nation, you are performing your dharma. Okay, so you can see this is the Adhunikva. This is the modern concept of nation. Some even say the Constitution of India should be our new Dharma Shastra. We must accept the Constitution of India as the representation of the Hindu civilization, and we must interpret it in such a way that it accommodates Hindu values. Many argue that many of the Hindu values are already there in the Constitution. Only thing is to practice it properly. And they criticize, say, Jawaharlal Nehru and the Congress leaders for not practicing the true spirit, the Hindu spirit of the Constitution, okay, which is, they say, it's real secularism and not pseudo-secularism. Okay, so you can see how the concept of dharma is evolved through different stages, from the Vedic society, which is 4,000-5,000 years old, to the Dharma Shastra period, okay, which is the reassertion of the Vedic principles when the Vedic system had spread all over India by that time. Then we can see the fourth phase is the Bhakti movement, where the concept of God becomes very important. Okay, the concept of Bhakti becomes very important. And then we can see the fourth period is the modern period, where we are talking about rationalism, egalitarianism, karma yoga, and finally the concept of nation. Okay, so I stop here. And now I request you to ask me questions or give your point of view. And I request you to do it through the audio instead of typing it, because it is being recorded. Okay, and I'd like to share it on YouTube. Okay, so please ask your questions related to this discussion. Okay, please go ahead. Shantanu, do you have to say anything? Did you understand?
Yes, sir, I understood. But talking about the concept of dharma, and do you believe that it has any role to play in the field of law and jurisprudence? Because it also does have an impact to what jurisprudence is. I mean, the development of the philosophy of law and things like that. So what's your take on that?
It's a very good question. So in India, what happens is, so I told you about these four different phases. But in India, it is not that one phase has supplanted the other phase. So it's simply that they coexist. So some people still follow the Vedas, they memorize the Vedas, they perform the Vedic rituals, and so on. There are other people who are very strict in the performance, although the number is declining, very strict in performing their Varnashrama Dharma and following the Dharma Shastras and so on. At the same time, Bhakti movement is very popular. Okay, people have to go to temples and they sing and dance and have katha and all that. So that is also popular. Simultaneously, the modern people, some even reject the Shastra, some interpret it in a modern way. Okay, and then we have the Hindu nationalists. So in India, different people coexist at the same time. Now the concept of dharma is important because yesterday, for example, Akshay Nayak was telling me that why don't we accept the Constitution of India itself as the Dharma Shastra, and give up all those other things and follow that. That is an interesting perspective. J. Sai Deepak has recently written a book, India, I think it's called India That is Bharat. Okay, so I think his argument is something like that. The Constitution itself contains civilizational values, and we should try to implement the Constitution in its true spirit, and that itself is following dharma in that sense. Yeah, so law is important in that sense. In from this perspective, law itself is dharma. To live according to the rule of law is dharma, because Constitution and the laws are our dharma shastras. At the same time, the ancient perspectives are also important because it's a way of life of millions of people in India. Okay, some of lesser practice, so like for example, in Sabarimala case, so they follow the tantra related to the worship of Ayappa. They follow their own Agam Shastra. So they say that certain age women cannot enter the temple, and so it goes to the Supreme Court. So it becomes a matter of law. So Agam Shastra becomes a matter of law, whether it's an essential practice of Hinduism. Okay, that is the question. Whether Ayappa worshippers are a sect. Okay, so these questions are there. So therefore, the concept of dharma is very important. We must understand. Okay, and understand it from the point of view of different people and different groups, because it will help us to interpret in the interpretation of our laws and interpretation of the Constitution also. Okay, so but that is not my job. I am just giving you the introduction to the topic. As lawyers, it's your you should be able to apply all these concepts in law and jurisprudence.
Also, when we see, I've not read a lot of Hindu law, but when we see, there is a lot of impact of ancient texts like Dharma Shastra and Dharma Sutra, as you mentioned. And those sutras or those literature that were there in the past definitely have a lot of impact in the modern law that has been made, especially in the Hindu law and Muslim law. I mean, talking about the Muslim or how the family laws are there. So I think that forms a coexistence between the two, wherein Dharma Sutras have a lot of impact on how Hindu law has been codified and things like that.
Right. So, there's a difference between Dharma Sutra and Dharma Shastras. Dharma Sutra are different texts because they're sutras, small statements. Sutra means a thread. Okay, so it's a, and Dharma Shastra is like Manusmriti, they are more detailed in nature. They contain shlokas. They're more detailed, they're bigger. Okay, so they are basically, Dharma Shastras are kind of a development of Dharma Sutra, which are directly related to the Vedas. Now, you are saying that a lot of Hindu law, personal law is influenced by the Dharma Shastras. This was actually argued by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar when he introduced the Hindu Reform Bill in 1948 as the law minister, but it did not get passed and he had to resign. But actually, in reality, after like the reform was introduced, many of the provisions in Hindu law completely contradict the injunctions in the Dharma Shastra. Like, for example, giving property to women and so on, right to divorce and so on. These are not there in the Dharma Shastras. There may be some reference somewhere, but so it's a long, so there are 100 statements saying one thing, and you find somewhere, some corner, some statement which may indicate that, and you try to justify. That Ambedkar tried to do that because he wanted to convince the other members of parliament, okay, that they should pass this particular bill. But they didn't do so because they understood that the Hindu Code Bill completely supplants the old Hindu law based on the Dharma Shastra. Later on, after Jawaharlal Nehru won the 1952 election, he had now a big majority of his own, which was commanded by him personally. And so he was able to then introduce the Hindu Marriage Act in 1955, and the three other acts subsequently was able to pass them. And so Hindu law was completely reformed, and it is not actually based on Dharma Shastra anymore. Like polygamy and all, those are not allowed. Those are allowed in Dharma Shastra. Okay, so somehow obviously there will be some influence because no law stands in a vacuum. Everything is a kind of a historical development. So obviously there is some influence of the older laws which were based on Dharma Shastra, but it has been substantially reformed. And there have been amendments again and again, and now daughters have equal property rights as sons. So all these things have been done. Muslim law,
So,
of
sir,
course, there's still a lot of influence of Sharia, but that is not our topic. Because our topic is on dharma. So let's focus on
so
this.
in that case, we can say that laws like Hindu Code Bill or the Hindu Marriage Act can be said as Anglo-Indian or Anglo-Hindu laws because they have a sort of impact from the British rule that had been there and the modern
No,
sense of it.
why should we? Like, because our parliament passed it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have done it. So it is Hindus themselves who have reformed the code. So why should we give any credit to the British? Because during the British, still there was a lot of influence of the Dharma Shastra. So all these practices, like women didn't have any property rights, or polygamy was practiced. There was no divorce. There was no intercaste marriage, and those things were not allowed during the British rule. Okay, and so it is we ourselves, our parliament, which passed this law. So it is we who have done it. So it is the Hindu law because we have done it. Okay, so why should we give any credit
Many
to the
reforms that were
British?
done during the British time, they brought some laws like during the time of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar or Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and in the 19th century and in the early 20th
Yes.
century as well. So there is a certain amount of impact of that as well. I feel so, sir.
No, it is there, obviously. See, it's a historical development because someone is ruling us, so someone has to, because we would not pass it. So obviously the British have to do it because they are ruling us. It was their duty to do it. If they want to govern the country, you need laws. So it is not that the British, out of their kindness, did it. There was a movement among the Hindus themselves. Like I talked about Ram Mohan Roy, or you mentioned Vidyasagar. So there are many people who themselves were recommending changes to the Hindu law. So obviously the British were ruling us. We didn't ask them to rule us, and so we could have done it ourselves if we were ruling. So why should we give any credit to them?
Yes, sir.
That's simply. Otherwise, historically, you are correct.
Sir, Shubham this side. Sorry,
Yes,
I was
Shubham.
not connected last time you called out my name. There was some network issue.
Yes.
So what I wanted to ask was that the concept of dharma is one of the most challenging of the Indian philosophical thought. So as you also already mentioned, and we know that the man is dharmic indicates the highest commendation of that particular man. Whether one ought to be dharmic or not is something which could be paralleled by whether one should be moral or not. I believe that I'm right in my assumption that morality is somewhere equivalent to being dharmic or something like that. But in the recent decades, what we see is that the discourse has changed. Uh, the dharmic man nowadays is seen from a very different lens and something sort of an orthodox man or like that. So what are the factors that led to this change of discourse in the modern times where the new generation or the younger generation is moving away from dharma?
Yeah. So yesterday I was having discussion with another group, and Akshay Nayak, who is a Sanskrit scholar, who, if you remember, has written this book on Panchatantra. So he was also saying that we should not. He was actually very skeptic of using this word dharma because the word dharma, as you can see, has been used in so many different senses. Either it's a performance of duty or it's being moral, ethical framework. So there could be some kind of a contradictory use, or say followers of rituals, someone who is doing bhakti, that is also called dharmic. So the word dharma has been used by different people for their own purpose. Because this word dharma is so important in our civilization that it has been adopted by different people. Now, the opposite is also true. So there's a reaction, kind of a modern reaction against our civilization, that some people feel that being Hindu is regressive. And so being dharmic also means like जो पूजा पाठ कर रहा है, मंदिर जा रहा है, तो वो उसको कुछ पता नहीं, लॉजिकल नहीं है, सुपरस्टिशियस है, एग्जाम में पूजा करके जाता है. And so their understanding is dharmic means you are superstitious somehow, backward and regressive. You don't treat women equally. You are so that is a perception among a certain section of the people. So that is right. But on the other side, there is a kind of a race. Everyone wants to call themselves dharmic. Okay, that is what we are discussing. So like he was very skeptical. So we shouldn't we completely reject the word dharma itself, or we should say dharma means ethical framework, and the other meanings we completely reject. So my argument was we have to take what we have. So as I told you, it's layer after layer. In India, there are people who follow dharma according to the Vedas, like it was practiced 4,000, 5,000 years ago, at least say 4,000 years ago. And there are others who practice dharma according to the bhakti movement or temple worship, like it was done 1,000, 2,000 years ago. Okay, so they are following that. Or some people are modern, they follow some modern way of life. So these things coexist in India. So therefore, it's not so easy. You cannot, in India, it's basically we are living in kind of a harmony between the 21st century and the first century and the second millennium BC. Everything is kind of combined in India. So that is the issue. So you have rightly identified that there are some people who criticize the concept of dharma. Personally, for me, the concept of dharma is very important because it's related to my personal life. So I try to understand dharma in a kind of a logical manner, which also is related to personal life, also related to social life, and I think the word dharma itself is very important because dharma, I have used this word dharma instead of say Hindu, because when you say Hindu, it becomes very sectarian in that sense. Like Buddhist, some Buddhists will say, or some Sikh will say that I'm not a Hindu, and so it will also exclude people, say in East Asia, who are Buddhist and so on. So, but the word dharma is acceptable as a civilizational concept. So Buddhists also believe in the word dharma, or the Sikh also they have this word dharma. So when you use the word dharma, it basically means the various Indian philosophical systems. So in that sense, but again, when you use the word Indian, the problem is that the Muslims will say, are we not Indians, or the Christians will say, are we not Indians? So the purpose of using the word dharma is because it occurs in the ancient, and some say the word Hindu does not exist and so on. Like in the Vedas or Manusmriti, there is no word Hindu. So how can you use the word Hindu? So therefore, I'm using the word dharma because it is a kind of a representative word, which occurs in almost every text, which is still revered by millions of people all over India, and also Buddhist in different parts of the world. So therefore, I have used the word dharma. Right, Shubham? Is it okay?
Yes, sir. I agree.
And I have seen that, like, what I am trying to do is try to present an academic perspective. We are developing this. I'm working with Akshay Nayak also and some other friends, like you had Mayank Goyal, so there are many friends who are interested in this discourse, and we are trying to develop. So this is my first lecture. This is not my last lecture, but first one. And then I'm going to give more lectures on the concept of dharma. My next lecture will be on different schools of thought, like Nyaya, Mimamsa, what is their understanding of reality and how it is connected to dharma. And the goal is to do a kind of an academic study and find something which is useful. Like Shantanu was asking, maybe we find something useful which can be applied to modern law and social sciences and modern jurisprudence. Maybe we find something useful. So my goal is not that of a religious preacher. I'm not telling you to become dharmic, or I'm not teaching you, excuse me, I'm not teaching you a kind of a particular interpretation of dharma. I'm trying to do a kind of academic survey of the literature existing on dharma.
Also, so there is
Okay.
one more question. You also talked about RSS and Hedgewar. So my point is that how the concept of dharma would help in making an Akhand Bharat, or help in not further dividing the Bharat, because till 6 months prior to partition, no one even thought that it would happen. Even Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was asked about the creation of Pakistan. He said that it was a dream of fools. And Lord Wavell also said in British Parliament that God has made India one, and who is going to divide it? But it eventually happened. So can we, in a sense, think and analyze that this concept of dharma may help in making this Akhand Bharat a realistic concept?
So in this, so the statement itself is not completely correct. So British till Lord Wavell did not think about dividing India. Only on Mountbatten came. He came with this plan, this idea that actually India could be partitioned because he had experience of the Second World War, and after the Second World War, they created, West Germany, partitioned Germany, they partitioned Korea and all that. So he had more experience in partitioning countries, and so he had this idea of how to partition India. Congress itself actually was in denial. Congress was in denial, but Ambedkar, even in 1940 itself, had accepted that the partition is inevitable. Okay, so in 1940 he wrote a report after the Lahore resolution of the Muslim League. He wrote a report that actually partitioning India would be good for India, which was published as a book in 1945. Okay, so there are a lot of people who understood, and of course the Hindu nationalists were also in denial. So Ambedkar criticizes them also because I told you they had this concept of Bharat Mata and so on. So dharma is important in the sense of like the RSS interpretation in that sense is it's in terms of service, in terms of selflessness. So instead of pursuing your own narrow self-interest, you should dedicate your life to society, service of society, in service of the nation. So in that sense, it is important. In terms of creating Akhanda Bharat, I don't know how it is important because unless the Muslims also accept this concept, okay, that is not possible because Pakistan and Bangladesh are gone because they are now, there's hardly any Hindu left. Okay. And even within India, the Republic of India, there are many parts where like the Kashmir Valley, where the Hindus have been driven out. So there also it's very difficult to convince them. It will be very optimistic to think that like the RSS is thinking that they would be able to integrate the whole country, okay, on this basis of this Hindu idea of one nation and service to the nation and so on. Okay, so my goal is not to like advocate what RSS is doing. I'm simply analyzing it. So it may work or it may not work. Okay, but it seems very unlikely that it will work if you follow the non-confrontational and a kind of a consensus building system that the RSS is right now trying to follow. Okay, so that it is very, very difficult. I think it's almost impossible because if someone does not accept, how would you convince them? That is a problem. Okay, Shubham. So I would like to quickly wind it up
sir.
because because I want to keep it within a time limit. Recording here. Thank you everyone for participating. Okay, I'll have another lecture later, maybe next month on different dharmic schools of thought. Thank you.